Hi tea sippers, welcome to an all new episode of Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. Let's get right into it because there's a lot to get to. Hi tea sippers, again welcome to an all new episode of Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. This is your host Mark Long. And you know I bring it to you fresh every week, but most importantly, we got a lot to get to, starting with the State of the Union. Donald Trump held the State of the Union earlier this week, and he definitely made up a bunch of stuff that he likes to do and just spout out of his mouth. But what's even more disturbing was the fact that his followers actually believe all of the false claims that he's making. Most importantly, it should be noted that some Democrats did not show up to the State of the Union, but the ones that did not have any problem heckling him. Take a listen.
Presidents often hit the road after the speech to sell their policies directly to the American people. President Trump will push his economic message in Texas at the end of this week, Amna, ahead of that state's primary elections on Tuesday.
Liz, as you just reported there, the president talked a lot about the strength of the economy. Two claims he made I want to ask you about. One about the price of gas, and the other that getting rid of fraud would enable the U.S. to have a balanced budget, as he put it, overnight. What can you tell us about those?
Let's start with the second part about balancing the budget. So that's implausible. We crunched some numbers. We looked at the math here. The federal deficit in 2025 was $1.8 trillion. The 2024 estimate of fraud in the U.S. Government Accountability Office had a range between $233 to $521 billion. That's a lot of fraud. But even if you eliminated all of the government fraud, the federal deficit would still only be reduced by a third there. Mm-hmm. And then on that second point of gas prices, we looked at gas prices all across the country. The president said that they are below $2.30 in most states. That is not true. Gas prices have fallen as he's been in office. Since he was inaugurated last year, the price of gas was around $3.11 a gallon. Now it's down to $2.97 a gallon today, as AAA says. But no state has an average of under $2.30 a gallon, again, per those AAA statistics. Same with Gas Buddy. The state with the lowest average price of gas is in Oklahoma, which has $2.40 a gallon, according to AAA.
The president also made a claim about reducing the number of Americans receiving food assistance. Take a listen to what he said.
And in 1 year, we have lifted 2.4 million Americans, a record, off of food stamps.
Liz, what should we understand about that?
So the data from the Agriculture Department found that a number of people who receive these Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits, or SNAP benefits, as most people know them, that did decline by 2.6 million people on those benefits from November of 2024 to November of last year. However, that 2.4 million person statistic, the figure that the president refers to, is likely Americans who are projected to lose those benefits following the passage of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act over the summer. So that's not necessarily people who were able to afford to get off of these SNAP benefits. That legislation expanded work requirements. So this analysis came from the Congressional Budget Office report, which is why at the time Democrats were concerned about people losing access to those SNAP benefits.
So, no shock there. The President of the United States is lying again, but most importantly, with his lies being blatant, and also shows how disconnected he is from society in general, and how he just has no clue what he's talking about, how he's just giving information and guessing at things and just being completely unfit for his job like he was the first time around. But let's dive deep into this. So Trump repeatedly described the economy as this undergoing historic turnaround in terms of making America great again, and insisting that inflation and prices were plummeting when we know that's not the case. But, fact checkers, including the people at PBS, found a lot of claims that are misleading and false to the American public, most importantly when it comes to the economy. So inflation had eased modestly, but not dramatically, and prices were not falling the way that he suggested. Some news outlets reported this, and this was NBC and the AFP, and they both noted that Trump overstated the scale of improvement while also sharing the fact that food affordability is still one of the most clearest and most immediate ways families experience economic pressure, and knowing that the president wasn't delivering on that in terms of prices still being up and people not seeing much changes when it comes to their grocery bills. Most importantly, when it comes to food assistance, while Trump didn't dwell on SNAP or food assistance directly, his economic claims basically set the stage for how his administration justifies like policy choices. He asserted that inflation is under control and that the economy is bigger and better and richer, to quote what he was saying. So that's clearly not true, because we know that PolitiFact and PBS also highlighted that the plummeting prices were misconstrued, but most importantly, families relying on SNAP benefits are still navigating the same strained budgets that they were dealing with before he got in office, and also even worse while he is in office. Some policy decisions right now obviously are under the guise of everything is improving, but right now we know that there's a risk there because a lot of Americans are not seeing that in their bank accounts or just kind of how their families are living day to day. Trump also talked about the broader economic narrative, right? He talked about, what was happening with the economy, how the country is so rich. And we know that this talking point was frequently distorted because of what happened with tariffs. Most importantly, and particularly with tariffs, it's been well documented that the downstream effects of tariffs have caused food prices to skyrocket, but most importantly, ingredients and farm equipment have taken a hit from tariffs. Most importantly, he kind of glossed over this as if things were happening just as normal as they should. The bigger picture here is obviously the economy, right? And what Americans are experiencing. Trump made claims about the economy, but let's break down what's happening here. So some economic gains were overstated, right? So he said that households that were relying on food assistance are now off of it, meaning that they don't need it, meaning that food's more affordable, when that's clearly not the case. He also spoke to that as if there was a victory around jobs and growth in terms of people being able to find work in the country. That's also not true. We know the unemployment rate has taken a hit based on all the cuts and all the budget cuts from programs that were already a part of our institution, our country. And Trump dismantled a bunch of things due to fraud and budget cuts or whatever he's trying to paint this as, that we know is not true. So the State of Union isn't just a speech, and this all felt very like playground with the president. He also talked a little bit about how, Democrats are not on his side in regards to illegal aliens, as he likes to put them, and really went after the fact that our country was unsafe under the Biden and Obama administrations, when in fact Trump was president once before, and if things were to change, he had that right to do that, while also claiming that election fraud is still a huge thing, and we know that that's also not the case as well. We all know that Trump was the one who asked for thousands of votes or whatever he was saying when he made that phone call, and people are excusing his behavior as very patriotic and American. Additionally, at the State of the Union, Trump had a contentious back and forth with one of the Congress people there. I'm gonna have you take a listen on this.
Isn't that a shame? You should be ashamed of yourself not standing up. You should be ashamed of yourself. That is why I'm also asking you to end deadly sanctuary cities that protect the criminals and enact serious penalties for public officials who block the removal of criminal aliens. In many cases, drug lords, murderers all over our country, they're blocking the removal of these people out of our country, and you should be ashamed of yourself.
Okay, so that was Representative Ilhan Omar, the Democrat from Minnesota, and she was basically challenging the president, saying that he killed Americans, which he did. His regime and the ICE officers, under their control and the funding that they're providing, killed actual American citizens, and ICE is continuing to kill Americans across the country. But most importantly, let's take another look at this. So basically, Trump was trying to insinuate and have like a show, because this is all a reality TV show for him. This is just something that makes him look good and makes him feel powerful. He wanted to make the point that people should stand up for him in his approach to how he's handling immigration, which we all know has been absolutely awful and disgusting. Most importantly, he echoed terms like illegal aliens again, which we all know that is not something that we say now. I think Republicans and conservative people who are just hateful and racist like to say words like that and to demean an actual human being to make them feel more powerful and more in charge of like their country or whatever they think it's just their country, when in reality it's all of our country. And it's so weird to even have to say that in 2026, but that's just how some of these Republican conservative racist people think. Most importantly, it's also good to note that at the State of the Union, the president didn't really address a lot of the concerns that a lot of Americans have. He kind of skated past them. And he also played this whole game of showmanship in terms of bringing in hockey players from the Olympics. It was the male hockey team. He also had Erica Kirk there, who apparently is still mourning her husband who was shot and murdered. There is no mention of Alex Preddy or Renee Good or any of the American citizens that were killed by or murdered, by ICE. There is also no mention of what's happening in terms of affordability for Americans. He talked about it and mentioned affordability as a hoax, as he likes to do. The president also echoed the fact that the economy and the numbers are where he wants them to be, while also making it very clear that he wasn't very happy with the decision that was made by the Supreme Court. Most importantly, in regards to the tariffs. So Donald Trump is grasping at straws here, and he knows he has a cult following and people that are looking at their bank accounts and wanting him to push their conservative agendas and their conservative ideology. We've seen most of Project 2025 come into play now here. But most importantly, that they're not done with doing some of their most egregious behavior in terms of trying to take the country back to something that's not really American and negates the progress that we've all made. But I think it's super interesting too, because now we have to look at the State of the Union as something that is theatrical, which is not normal for Americans. We typically, even if you don't agree with the president, you typically tune in to make sure that you are seeing where the country is. This is the State of the Union, right? This is supposed to let us know how it's like to be an American. Right now, Donald Trump and his entire administration are currently under the lens regarding the Epstein files, and a lot of them are pedophiles and child abusers, and there's a lot of information in these files to show that. So they're using every moment that they can to say, look how great we're doing, and to pivot in regards to some foreign affairs and talking about, accomplishments of Americans and making America great, when in reality, we know that these people are counting Americans' dollars and stealing from the American public, while also not basically solidifying the fact that we are in turmoil because our country is being ran by a felon. And another interesting aspect to bring up is not only did Donald Trump not address the Epstein files, but is very, very, very prevalent that the entire administration is doing whatever they can to just skate past it, when we all know that when you are a person who doesn't address abuse and you just brush it under the rug, or you trying to protect someone who raped and molested underage girls and boys, that typically speaks to your character, which is not very Christian, as they like to say they are. So the entire MAGA cult is up Trump's ass, and I think we're going to see a lot more coming out from this, especially with the rollout from the Clintons as they start to testify in regards to Jeffrey Epstein.
Emerging from a 6-hour-long deposition with the House Oversight Committee, former Secretary of State and former First Lady Hillary Clinton defiant.
I don't know how many times I had to say I did not know Jeffrey Epstein. I never went to his island. I never went to his homes. I never went to his offices. So it's on the record numerous times.
In a blistering opening statement, Clinton insisting she and her husband, former President Bill Clinton, were being forced to testify to distract attention from President Trump's actions and to cover them up despite legitimate calls for answers.
They asked literally the same questions over and over again, which didn't seem to me to be very productive.
Clinton accusing Republicans of being off topic.
It then got, at the end, quite unusual because I started being asked about UFOs
She had demanded that the deposition be public, but Republicans refused.
It was disappointing that they refused to hold a public hearing, so I wouldn't have to be out here characterizing it for you. You could have seen it for yourself.
Still Republicans making a political show of it. The deposition forced to briefly stop after Congresswoman Lauren Boebert snapped this photo from inside the room, sending it to conservative influencer Benny Johnson, who then posted it online.
One of the members violated that rule, which was very upsetting because it suggested that they might violate other of our agreements.
While the Republican-led committee has deposed other associates of Epstein's, it has not called Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, who, after insisting he had nothing to do with Epstein, testified that he had visited Epstein's private island with his family well after Epstein was convicted of sex crimes.
That was from Good Morning America this morning in regards to Hillary Clinton testifying in regards to the Epstein deposition. And Bill Clinton is set to come and testify later this week. But I think a few things to point out here that I think are very important. Hillary Clinton showed up to the deposition and answered questions. And let's be very, very clear. Hillary Clinton has no ties to Jeffrey Epstein whatsoever. Bill Clinton does, right? And the fact that she was the first to be questioned shows what this administration is trying to do in terms of switching the narrative any way they that too, any way they can to change the narrative off of Donald Trump. And I think what's most importantly that we have to recognize is that Donald Trump has not been questioned about any of this. So, Mr. Pedophile, I'm going to give a State of the Union, but I could care less about what you all are saying because I'm rich, is actually in the Epstein files and has committed crimes against 13 and 14-year-old girls numerous times. That is a known fact. We see that there's information redacted in these files. But most importantly, I think that anybody that is being called in or anybody that is being mentioned is what I meant in the files should be called in to answer any questions. If you have nothing to hide, or if you're not connected to Jeffrey Epstein, or if your team reached out to his team because he's rich or whatever, and you needed a plane, whatever. I think that this is an egregious crime to the point where anybody and any person involved or had any inkling of anything that was happening with the victims and the survivors in this case should be questioned. You know what I mean? Now, even if you heard rumblings and if someone was your best friend that, I hear that he abuses people, that's still, in my opinion, complicit and speaks to your character and who you are. The fact that the Trump administration and the Republicans are going above and beyond to paint this narrative about the Clintons and that they're involved in scandals all the time, blah, 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 blah. Whether that be the narrative that they want to run with, go with it. But we also have to look at the facts here. The Epstein files situation and dilemma has created an international turmoil situation in regards to getting people like pretty much incarcerated and held accountable that had few interactions with Epstein but were a part of his whole sex trafficking scheme. And we know that the sex trafficking scheme continued for a while because even before and after previous convictions from Epstein, people were still communicating with him. Meaning that there was some knowledge about his behavior because it was out there and available for people to look up and people to know. Especially if you're close with someone and you're high up, you're going to get this information. Like, come on. So, I say that to say that this country right now is clearly being shifted in a direction of white supremacy and excusing abuse and hiding crimes, which we all know, as I said in a previous episode, that this crime is way worse than Watergate, in my opinion. I think when it comes to child abuse and when it comes to any kind of abuse whatsoever, I think that people should be held in a different kind of, people should definitely be sent to life in jail, in my opinion. I don't think you should be around people, in my opinion. I also think that in some cases you should be sentenced to death. I think if you're someone that is a serial abuser of children and people are not consenting and you are doing that, then you don't have a right to be around people, let alone live in a space where people are trying to live life and be happy. I think it's beyond a mental illness. It's a crime and it's something that should be punishable. And I think this country is doing us a disservice and not looking at how other countries are responding to this. And people are looking at the Dow, as Pam Bondi said, in a way to distract from the efforts that are happening right now. Now, I know another talking point from this administration is that so much information is coming out. President Trump signed this, so doesn't that mean that there's more happening than has happened before? No, because you're releasing files and you're redacting them because you're trying to control the narrative. And you're doing it in a way to put a middle finger up to Democrats, which makes sense why you would do that, because if these crimes were around for years and years, decades, if you will, then there was plenty of opportunity for previous administrations to take it upon themselves and do a little bit more digging here. But I think it comes into play because inklings of this is why the president became reelected. He ran on this whole narrative of people wanting to find out about the Epstein files, and people were pissed about it. And people were pissed on the right because they thought prominent Democrats were in the Epstein files. And what we know is that, yes, that's the case, but we also know that prominent Republicans and people who are in charge of the country are also child abusers and pedophiles. And I think we have to look at this from the angle of calling it what it is and moving accordingly and hoping for justice. I think, hope for justice, because right now the president is getting away with the most egregious crime in the history of this country. Shifting gears a little bit here, so I wanted to talk a little bit more about what's happening in regards to immigration in the country, as the president has insinuated that, they are cracking down, and obviously we know that there's been several, civil unrest and also, like, murders by ICE agents, but that we don't have to go too much over that. I want to talk a little bit more about how people are being onboarded, right? So, a former ICE attorney and academy instructor, Ryan Schwenk, has come forward with detailed allegations that the agency, meaning ICE, has drastically cut training hours. Can you all believe that? So, multiple reports confirm that ICE has slashed more than 200 hours from its academy curriculum, dropping the total training from roughly 584 hours to about 344. The cuts eliminated or weakened instruction on constitutional rights, lawful arrest procedures, use of force standards, and legal thresholds for entering home. Let's say that again. The cuts to the training, this is insane, involve constitutional rights, lawful arrest procedures, use of force standards, and legal thresholds for entering homes. So, Schwenk told Congress that the academy is now deficient, defective, and broken because recruits are graduating without knowledge of, how to avoid unlawful arrests or dangerous encounters with American citizens. So, this is all coming from a news source by the name of, I think it's the International, let's get it for you, so you can look it up wherever you get your news, but the International Business Times in the UK reported that. But let's also dive in more. So these orders to violate the Constitution are very clear, and Schwenk testified that on his first day at a Georgia training facility, he was given secretive directives to teach cadets that they could enter homes without a judicial warrant. Furthermore, a hiring search without safeguards is also happening. So ICE is in the middle of a massive hiring push, and whistleblowers say that leadership is lowering standards to push recruits through as quickly as possible. We also know that there are some entities and mayors that have had complaints because their police officers, especially across southern states, are leaving the police force that they are a part of or at their local districts to become ICE agents, and which is creating an issue in regards to safety for local communities across the country. But we all know there's a bunch of funding that has just poured in due to the budget cuts, and the fact that a lot of those budget cuts allowed for this administration to put more funds into immigration reform, into security at the border, and into ICE raids across the United States. CBS News is also reporting that Congress basically is saying that they're trying to expand poorly trained officers, or expand training for poorly trained officers, and also, but anyway, the CBS reports that, but we all know that's not the case, given the information that has been coming out recently. What can we also say? So, the increased risk of unlawful arrest is something that should be very, very scary to a lot of people, because right now there's a law where if an ICE agent suspects someone of being here illegally, they have a right to question them, they have a right to detain them based on information and knowledge that they have on their own. Does that mean that unlawful arrests are happening? And does that mean that potential American citizens have already been arrested by ICE? Absolutely. That's what that means. So there's threats to the Fourth Amendment protections right now, especially. And Shrink also mentioned that they're teaching officers that they can enter homes without a warrant. But he also mentioned that this undermines one of the most fundamental civil liberties of the United States law. Especially alarming, right? Because ICE agents' history of conducting home raids in immigration communities is not great. We know that with this reduced training and increased hirings, it's just a recipe for disaster. And there's also more opportunities for growing operational risk. So, with that being said, all of what he's describing with these 200 hours that are cut and how things are being enforced the way that they are, it puts us in a position where I think the country, and I think this administration, I should say not the country, but this administration, wants us to be scared of their recruits. And they also want to position their recruits and position their ICE agents as an entity that is just as public as the police. And we all know this country already has a history with police and how they got started. And don't get me started there with the racist history behind police. But most importantly, I think there's good cops and there's clearly bad cops. But most importantly, there's definitely good ICE agents and bad ICE agents. And I think from what we're going to get here, we're going to get a lot of loopholes where a lot of illegal stuff is going to happen. And I think we're going to start seeing a lot more murders, as we still are, on American citizens across the country. Alright, T-Sippers, I wanted to end things here by taking a trip to the past just to see how far we've come. But most importantly, I want you to hear from these people that are talking about the desegregation of busing on their first day of school in Dallas in 1971. Now, we know this is post all the civil unrest in the 60s, but most importantly, the 70s was a good prominent time for African Americans and for Black people because we got the opportunity to start embracing more of who we are and leaning more into our identity of what it means to be Black. Take a listen.
You're going to Skyline now, right?
Righteous.
What do you think about this busing thing?
Well, I think we'll make it the first few days, but the rest of them will be kind of tough.
Why is that?
Well, some of the students are hanging out to see how things going on, and most of them are troublemakers.
The ones who are hanging out?
Yeah.
So when they start coming to school, you think it's going to get bad?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it will.
What do you expect?
There's going to be a lot of fighting.
Are you concerned for your daughter, or is she concerned?
Well, I'm concerned for her, and I think she's concerned for her education.
Laverne just talked to your mother, and she said you're a little concerned, are you?
I'm very much concerned.
Why?
Oh, because I want to be sure and very, very, I want to be very sure about this here, and I want them really know what they're doing. And I think that it will work out if everybody cooperate together, because, this is not the probably first time. You got to be together sometime, and I don't think it's no problem if everybody cooperate.
Well, I haven't understood yet exactly what it is you're concerned about.
Oh, well, I'm concerned about my schoolmates and everything, and I'm concerned about how we'll be treated and everything like that, and very much concerned about the education what we're going to receive. And
Concerned about the education?
Concerned about my education.
Alright, so let's talk a little bit about busing discrimination in the 70s. So, the school bus was supposed to be like a simple thing, right? People were supposed to get on the bus and go to school, and people typically fetch about going to school. Some people don't like going to school, right? Especially kids. But in a time where education was seen as like a ticket to success, education was more valued than what we knew. And I think during the 70s, the bus became a symbol of everything America was fighting about, which was race, right? Power, equality, neighborhood identity, and people deserving access to equal opportunity, and education was one of them. So after the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional, districts across the country dragged their feet, right? But we know by the early 70s a lot of schools were still segregated, and Black children were still attending overwhelmingly segregated, underfunded schools, while white children rode buses past them to their better resource campuses. So let's dive a little bit more into that. Federal courts stepped in during the 70s, and if neighborhoods were still segregated, and they were by design, of course, the buses would cross those invisible lines, right? So children would be transferred across town to integrate schools that had never been meant to welcome them. And it was a corrective measure, but in practice, it was definitely not anything that was easy or smooth sailing. What we saw was, like, from the 50s and the 60s, we see people fleeing to the suburbs, right? Especially because of the racial exclusion and the overcrowding in cities and people moving from the south to large cities and then white people moving out due to the zoning laws which crafted neighborhoods to be more stable in the burbs and for there to be not any people of color, no black people. So school districts drawn like little moats around whiteness and make sure that they had like things that were curated specifically for their communities. But most importantly, good schools was something that was very, very, very like the fantasy suburban life. And a lot of people moved to the suburbs because of this notion, because they believe that children were seen and not heard. And when it comes to things being so perfect, that means go to school, come home, do your homework, blah, blah, blah. Once you mix race into the situation, it becomes a huge ordeal, right? Especially for those who are trying to escape anything to enjoy their life and live luxury in their whiteness. But busing carried out black students, right? And we see an example from the South Boston High School in 1974, when they were met by crowds of people throwing rocks, racial slurs, and threats. And it's super important to mention that this is in a southern school. Boston's in Massachusetts, so this is on the East Coast. And it's super important to know that access to education has been something that has been policed for a very long time. And for the children that ride the bus, who rode the bus back then, can you imagine what was going through their head just for having access to something that the government is saying that you should have access to education and proper education, and to have adults and other kids that were being misinformed to attack them and to ridicule them? It just kind of puts things into perspective for us nowadays when it comes to the politics of choice, right? Obviously, some Republicans took that as having more opportunity for private schools because they believed that the public school entity was being infiltrated by equality and people having access to education. But we know by the late 70s, the country was already exhausted by everything that happened in the 60s. So some cities saw some real progress. But most integrated classrooms started to see, the funding become a little bit more questionable as there started to be more equal access to education. But I pointed this out today because I want people to understand the importance of, learning about where we started versus where we are right now. Again, we're only 100 years removed from Jim Crow. But most importantly, we're not that far removed from just the idea that people didn't have equal access to education and that they still do not. This current administration has made it difficult for brown and black people to have equal access by putting different rules and parameters around student loans, who gets access to go to school, attacking affirmative action and DEI. And this just comes to show you that there's a lot of undoing and fear of what it means to be an educated person of color. And during Black History Month, I think it's important for us to look back at that history and really value the idea of choice in this country, not even when it comes to education, but when it comes to being a person of color and being black and being resilient. And basically, if white people have access to something, we have access to it too. And I think we have to start getting a little bit more direct and assertive about opportunity and take it by the horns and make it ours. I think it's super important, especially hearing that girl talk in a video about, she's fearful. She doesn't know what's going to happen to her or her classmates. And people still live like that. We know redlining still exists. We know that places like Milwaukee is known for how segregated it is and how disproportionately black and brown people are treated. But most importantly, how black and brown people are not being given equal opportunity. And if they are being given opportunity, it's not as funded and it's very, very not thought out or thought through. So just some food for thought to end things here. Thanks for listening to an all-new episode of Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. I bring it to you fresh every week, but most importantly, I bring you all the news and updates. Thanks for listening.